the blues on the stool. Head wrapped silky, chewing on this oxtail. Scheming on the millie, trying to hit the yacht sail. Gold shining lobster near the Everglade music. When we drop, it's like you never made music. Better days never came easy to a quitter. Ain't no pump faking, let them see that I deliver. God body, baby, big 7 in the skin. Probably why you never hear no better again. Higher than the spot that we about to set the bar. Stankin', smell it before it left the jar. I just left the coast straight to another ocean. Got excuses, me, I'm really having motion. Sipping on mimosa, chopping real estate game. 40 years later, still the same lane. Just left the hood, never heard of you. 30 long years, not a single word of you. Shop booming, baby, come and get it while it's open. I don't have time, I've been busy having motion. Just left the town, things spoke to you. You a L7, probably served to you. Shop still booming, come and get it while it's open. I don't have time, I've been really having motion. Boy, stop playing, this is not your lane. Never seen struggle, you do not know pain. Stop playing, would you be yourself? How they see you, how you see yourself. Ain't real, acting real fictitious. Family on the west probably still hit switches. Playing Sally Cell, brought the thumper in the car. I been down in Austin burning rubber down Lamar. Keep what you earn, put it back in the business. Gold mouth shorty spinning racks at the dentist. One stream need a whole 7 ways. That weaker than a whole 7 days. I've been playing chess, working on the left brain. Buzzing in my city way before the press came. Went and bought a now he think he less lame. Got the kind of gas that could fuel a jet plane. Just left the hood, never heard of you. 30 long years, not a single word of you. Shop booming, baby, come and get it while it's open. I don't have time, I've been busy having motion. Just left the town, things spoke to you. You a L7, probably served to you. Shop still booming, come and get it while it's open. I don't have time, I've been really having motion. Y'all know what time it is. Jerry, what up? Lords of the land. Ain't got no minutes for you, internet. We really outdoors with it. Till infinity. And we out.
All right, welcome to Paradigm Shift TV 314. This is your brother, DMG the Poet, aka Brother Pianki, and we have a powerful and interesting show for you today with an established guest on the program coming back for the second time. Before we get into our spiel, let me do my usual greeting. Let me say God bless to my Christian brothers and sisters. Let me say Hotep to my Kemetic brothers and sisters. Shalom to my Israelite brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum to my brothers and sisters in the NOI. Islam to my Moorish brothers and sisters. Peace to my brothers and sisters in the nation of gods and earth, them 5%ers. Let me say what's up to my atheist brothers and sisters. Salute to my Abo brothers and sisters. I want to say what's up to my Rasta brothers and sisters. And last but not least, I want to say Jambo to the rest of my brothers and sisters throughout the African diaspora, be it here in the wilderness of the United States of America or beyond. Y'all know I say that greeting for one reason and one reason only. It's because if you're black, I'm with you, and I hope that you're with me. Our different ideologies should not keep us from uniting. We can't have unity without uniformity, and we can disagree without being disrespectfully disagreeable. I know we find that hard to believe, but we can do it. That being said, one of these days, I'm going to make a lot of y'all mad because I'm going to replace that black part with, if you human, I'm with you. And I hope you with me. I'm going to tell y'all why. If you cut us open, it's all the same. I don't know anybody foolish enough to deny themselves a life-saving organ based on the skin color of the donor. Y'all take that nugget with you. With that being said, Edward Dodge, welcome back to the program.
DMG, it's great to be here, and peace and respect to you, and peace and respect to the entire audience, everybody in the audience, and it's a pleasure to be here and talking to you. And as far as the, like Bob Marley said, until the color of a man's skin is no more significant than the color of his eyes. That's it. Hopefully, we're all working towards that. It's a big journey to get there. It's not so easy, but hopefully, we'll get there one of these days.
One of these days. I saw they got a movie coming out about Bob Marley. I didn't even realize that until I saw the trailer. So
I saw the trailers. I'm not sure what to think. I'm not getting my hopes up for
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. I'll check it out. Just
he would appreciate our topic tonight, I think.
Exactly. So let's get right into it. What are we discussing tonight?
We're talking about marijuana in the Bible, my friend. Marijuana, specifically marijuana in the Old Testament, although I'm prepared to talk about it in the New Testament too. It's really about the First Temple. And so this is a presentation. This is actually a scholarly presentation that I did with, I co-wrote it with Chris Bennett, who's a noted writer on cannabis history and cannabis in the Bible. He's the guy I learned most of this stuff from. And then we've both been working on it lately. So, but yeah, we co-wrote this and presented it. So this is the scholarly argument for why cannabis is in the First Temple, and it goes it's part of the bigger story we talked about before of First Temple polytheism, that they're not monotheists in the First Temple, they're still totally pagan, and cannabis was part of the goddess traditions, and it gets thrown out with the goddesses, with Asherah and the rest of the goddesses. But during the whole First Temple, it was alive and well. So if you can go to the next slide. I don't have control of the slides here, so we can get right into it.
All right.
But yeah, ritual use and rejection. We're going to talk about not only that it was being used, but we're going to show where they're throwing it out. We're going to show where they get rid of it, and because it's clearly not part of Judeo-Christian traditions today. So there are 5 Bible verses that mention cannabis. The 5 verses in the Old Testament that use the word canna or cannabism are mentions of cannabis. They are mistranslated as either a different plant named calamus or else as aromatic cane. And in all 5 instances, cannabis fits the context, while calamus or aromatic cane do not. Canna is described as a sacred ingredient in Moses' holy anointing oil. This is the most important one. An ingredient in Moses' holy anointing oil. This is key. It's a valued aromatic herb. It's a burnt offering in the temple twice, and as an object of trade from Lebanon, out of Tyre. Cannabis was later thrown out in the reformations of the Yahweh Alone movement. Next slide. So marijuana in the Bible. This is an important scholarly question. It is not just trivia for potheads. If it can be proven true that canna is cannabis and that it was burned in the first Hebrew temple, then there are profound theological, historical, cultural, and legal implications that reverberate in today's society. They're doing the war on drugs. They've been doing it all our lives, arresting people for marijuana. Maybe a little bit less nowadays, but no one talks about it, being sacred to Moses. And that would totally change the entire conversation of the global war on drugs if we were talking about it being sacred to Moses in the First Temple. All right. Or for the old Israelites. All right. Next slide. All right. So what plant is being referred to? Biblical commentary often refers to the spices mentioned as vague and ambiguous. This is the definition. Sweet calamus, aromatic cane. It is impossible to say what exactly was the spices here intended. Calamus is mentioned as a spice in Exodus 23, Isaiah 43:24, Jeremiah 6:20, Ezekiel 27:17, and Song of Solomon 4:14. The term used, canna, cane, is vague, and it is not all clear that what species is alluded to. This is a definition we took from a book. Bosom means sweet or aromatic, and various candidates that have been suggested have been included calamus, gingergrass, camel grass, lemongrass, sugarcane, balm oil, fennel, and other plants as well. All right, next slide. So what is calamus? This is the typical definition of what's in the holy anointing oil. And, and it is a medicinal plant, so people make the claim that it's calamus. So let's examine the claim. So what is calamus? Acorus calamus L, known as sweet flag, a herbaceous perennial. The flowers are sweetly fragrant. It is a well-known plant used in Indian traditional medicines for many centuries. It's a marsh plant that likes having wet feet. Its aroma makes calamus essential oil, valued in the perfume industry, and it is used as a flavor for foods, alcoholic beverages, and bitters in Europe. Now, this would make you think that it is like a good candidate for the holy anointing oils. So far, so good, right? It's the next detail that really kills it, though. A calamus, such as its oil, were banned from use as a human food or as a food additive in 1968 by the United States Food and Drug Administration. The FDA banned calamus because it contains more than 75% acerone, and acerone is a poison which has been shown to cause cancer and has ill effects on heart, liver, and kidney functions. The toxin in calamus is used for pest control. So now, the point is, if you use calamus in very small ingredients, like as bitters in a cocktail where it's like a drop in your glass, then it's not going to make you sick. But as we get into the ingredient for the Moses Holy Anointing Oil and you see the quantities involved, you would see that it very clearly would not work in that recipe. In fact, people have tried it and it makes you sick. All right, next slide. All right, Sula Bennett. She is this is the scholar that first noticed this. The etymology of cannabism as cannabis was first identified by the Polish scholar Sula Bennett, aka Sarah Benetawa, in her 1936 PhD thesis from Columbia University, and again in a 1975 paper. Her work has been confirmed by modern scholars, though her conclusions are controversial, particularly to Orthodox believers. Now, Sula Bennett is an obscure academic. Nobody ever would have heard of her. But she was in touch with, the scholars of the day and the people that are relevant in the fields. She's, not famous, but she is a real scholar. So anyway, next slide. Canna or Kunubu. Cannabism has clear similarities to other ancient names for cannabis, such as the Assyrian Kunubu. Kunubu is listed as an ingredient in the sacred rites in a letter by the mother of Assyrian king Esarhaddon in 680 BC. This is during the same time period as the First Temple. Cannabis was widely used for both fibers and drugs across the Bronze Age, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Persia, and is thoroughly documented as deeply sacred in India since prehistoric times. We're just establishing here that cannabis was widely used in the area. There's nothing unusual about it in this time period of the Bible. It was being used in Mesopotamia, both for fiber and for drugs. And the etymology, there's actually a lot to be said about the etymology of both the word hemp and the word cannabis and canna. There's like you could write a whole book on it. We don't go into the details here. This is just we're just touching on it. Anyway, next slide. Yeah, just skip this. This is boring stuff from Hebrew thing. It's more like Hebrew scholarly stuff about that plant. Let's go on. Let's get to the good stuff. Next slide. All right. Strong's Concordance. This is the again, more definitional stuff. The Concordance lists all the Hebrew words in the Bible, and they've got a number on them, and you can look them up. And when you're doing digital research like I do on BibleHub.com, it's amazingly fantastic as a amateur scholar to be able to use the computer tools to cross-reference and search for Hebrew words in the Bible. It's an amazing tool. Like 21st century digital scholarship opens up the doors to non-experts in a way that that's enabled all of my work. I did all these word searches for Asherah, all the word searches for every goddess, all the word searches for cannabis. And you can start to kind of use these digital tools because these dictionaries have been developed over centuries, right, of hard work by biblical and Jewish scholars. But now as a 21st century person with a computer toolkit that can do translations for you, and soon enough it'll be AI. It's amazing what we have access to us. But anyway, this is a quick on canna. There's actually 62 occurrences of it. I only mentioned 5. The other ones where it's also the word is for branch and for reed. Hemp, branch, reed. It's the same word, fellows. It is not hard to imagine the same word for hemp. Hemp fibers, a tall stalk, 10 feet tall, being the same word for branch or for reed. And most of these occurrences for the word branch are in the overwhelming majority of them are in the in the instructions for the menorah. When they pound out how to make the menorah with 7 branches here and 7 branches of this and 7 branches of that, branch. It keeps using the word canna. And this is actually not part of our argument here, but Chris and I both strongly believe that the menorah is based on the cannabis plant and that there's a lot of, less strong evidence for that, but there's a lot of evidence for it. It's not as strong as these 5 verses, but I do in fact think that the menorah is the cannabis plant and that Moses is basically Rasta. And that anyway, go on, next slide. We'll talk.
Did you say Moses was basically Rasta?
Moses, I'm going to repeat myself. Moses is basically Rasta. He's smoking mad ganja, and they throw it out later on. But the original Moses was, yeah. The the Rastas love all this stuff. I mean, some of the stuff they believe all this too. The burning bush, the menorah, they already say that. So like, it's not Chris and I are not coming up with all this stuff uniquely,
Okay.
All right, here's more about Canna equals branch reed stock. I just explained this. All right, so this is more stuff. All right, this is what I was just talking about. Make a lampstand of pure gold, hammer out its base and shaft, make its flower-like cups, buds and blossoms of one piece with them 6 branches, Canna, are to extend from one side of the lampstand, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. This is the instructions for making the menorah. And if you read this, it goes on page after page. This is a particularly long set of instructions for how you make the menorah. This is just one like little short clip. Anyway, next slide. All right, now we're getting to the good stuff. Here's Moses' holy anointing oil. This is the most of the 5 verses. This is the most important one. And many people, especially like theologians and critical scholars, will just look at this one verse alone and say, we don't really think it's marijuana. It's not a very strong case. But they're only looking at the one verse. They're not looking at all 5. They're not looking at the bigger context. Because if you just take this one verse alone, maybe it's not as convincing. But all 5 verses together, it is. Anyway, this is the most important one because the holy anointing oil, let's just step back for a second. This was an instruction directly from God to Moses, along with making the Ark of the Covenant and the tent of the tabernacle and all this stuff during the Exodus. And this holy anointing oil is used to anoint all of the sacred goods inside the temple, all the furnishings, all the furniture. But most importantly, it anoints the high priests and the kings. And when they anoint them, they would like pour it down over your head. So it's dripping off of your beard. There's elaborate descriptions of it. I might even have a slide of it. Anyway, so when you're doing it like that, and this is a very potent recipe, that is can be a very intense experience with all this set and setting and ritual that would go along with it. That's the kind of thing that really gets you talking to God, so to speak. So anyway, let's read this instructions here. Take the following fine spices: 500 shekels of liquid myrrh, half as much, that is 250 shekels of fragrant cinnamon, 250 shekels of fragrant cannabis, cannabism, 500 shekels of cassia, all according to the sanctuary shekel, and a hin of olive oil. Make these into a sacred anointing oil, a fragrant blend, the work of a perfumer. It will be the sacred anointing oil. Let's see, is the next. All right. I was just trying to see what slides I had made up. So this is the work of a perfumer is like a very like specific instruction set. Like this is a technique to make perfumes and incense and kind of things. And so what they're doing is they're taking like 8 pounds of marijuana and putting it into like 6 gallons of olive oil and along with these other spices, and they're cooking it all up. And it is extremely potent. People make this today in California. Like I've had it with herbalists in California and in the Golden Triangle up there in the Emerald Triangle, I should say, not the Golden Triangle. That's Asia. The Emerald Triangles in California. And this is this stuff is like as a medicinal kind of herbal medicine. This stuff works. It's very potent.
I was just about to say, how was it? But
I mean, I've only ever sampled it, but like I didn't like pour it down over my head or anything dramatic. That's kind of expensive, Even in California, that's expensive. Okay. But I mean, I've known herbalists. More to the point, I've met herbalists who make it and they swear by it. It's be a more exact claim. I've sampled it, but like not enough to like have a dramatic experience. It's kind of an intense, all the cinnamon and stuff. People use cannabis medicines all the time, but mixing it up with all these other ingredients would make a different sort of specific effect. And it's like that's like a lot of cinnamon, a lot of other stuff. It's like that in and of itself is it's a very specific recipe and very.
Yeah, I can imagine because
that's what it does even, but
because in particularly in the Black church, I can't speak for many others, but they do anoint you when you go up for prayer, and I could always like smell the cinnamon in the oil. So I'm just trying to picture,
well, I mean, well, actually go to the next slide. Go to the next slide. Actually, we'll speak to this, like what they did with the oil in the church. So this is commentary, priestly commentary from 1857, talking about this exact verse. Interpreters are not agreed concerning these ingredients. The spices, which were in all nearly half a hundredweight, were to be infused in the oil, which was to be about 5 or 6 quarts, and then strained out, leaving an admirable smell in the oil. With this oil, God's tent and all the furniture of it were to be anointed. It was to be used in all the consecration of the priests. It was to be continued throughout the generations. Exodus 30:31. Solomon was anointed with it. 1 Kings 1:39. And some of the other kings and all the high priests, with such a quantity of it as that it ran down the skirts of the garments. And we read of the making it up, 1 Chronicles 9:30. Yet all agree that in the second temple there was none of this holy oil, which was probably owing to a notion they had that it was not lawful to make it up. You know, maybe because it had marijuana in it, it was totally intoxicating. And by that point, they're like, we don't want marijuana in our temple anymore. That's pretty much the argument.
Man. Let me know when you want me to go to the next one.
Yeah, next slide. Yeah. So Song of Solomon, this is the second reference. Now, Song of Solomon, King Solomon, he's the one romantic guy in the Bible. This is the only romantic, sexy part in the entire Bible. And it's his whole love poetry between him and his beautiful bride. And this passage is cannabis is listed with a bunch of other aromatic plants, mostly drug plants. Another thing I haven't mentioned is it's always being associated with myrrh. You'll see cannabis listed alongside myrrh and frankincense repeatedly because they're all ingredients in incense. So your plants, this is Songs 4:13 and 4:14. Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates with choice fruits, with henna and spikenard and saffron, cannabis and cinnamon, with all the trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, and all the finest spices. So it's just being listed among all these aromatic herbs, which totally makes sense. But there's also kind of like drug and incense plants too. All right, so next slide. Isaiah, this is one of the burnt offerings. So Isaiah, this is Isaiah's late in the first temple when things are starting to go badly. And it's being critical of the Israelites. So this is Yahweh speaking. I have not burdened you with offerings or wearied you with frankincense. You have not brought any cannabis with silver for me or lavished on me with the fat of your sacrifices, but you have burdened me with your sins and wearied me with your iniquities. So basically, Yahweh is angry that cannabis is not being brought to him. Now, Chris argues that this is evidence of them getting rid of cannabis. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's at least clearly they're talking about it. I think he's just mad that he hasn't been brought it. Not that, but anyway, either way, it's clearly a reference to they're burning it as a burnt offering in the first temple. All right, so next slide. Ezekiel's another prophet. This is in the context. Ezekiel was Tyre was like this coastal city on the coast of Lebanon. At the time, it was an island, and it was like the richest, they were like the most sophisticated traders and artisans and the wealthiest people, most sophisticated people in the entire Mediterranean. And the Hebrew prophets are like denouncing them and saying you're going to be destroyed and all this stuff. So Ezekiel is condemning the city of Tyre. And here they're just talking about him, saying, Damascus did business with you because of your many products and great wealth of goods. They offered wine from Helbon, wood from Zahar, and casks of wine from Izal in exchange for your wares, wrought iron, cassia, and cannabis. So again, like cannabis is like definitely a trade good. Calamus, like I don't know how much people are worried about calamus as a trade good. All right, so next slide.
I'm blown away that this has been there all this time and nobody ever talks about it. All
right, so now this is more good stuff. This is the archaeology where they've really proven it. So there is the Tel Arad is one of the most famous archaeological sites in Israel, and it is the only spot where they've dug up a temple that was from the time period of the first temple, and it was very carefully. I have a second slide about it. Anyway, it was buried in the reforms. And so that's why they were able to dig it up, was because in the forms of either Hezekiah or Josiah, they had carefully laid everything down and buried it by hand. And so there's a pair of incense altars you can see there, and a pair of standing stones behind it, which we'll get to. They were all carefully laid down on their sides and buried by hand. So there was a pair of incense altars, and and the temple has the same structure as the Jerusalem temple. So there's a 3-room structure with the Holy of Holies in the back, with a little room in the Holy of Holies. And what we're looking at here in this picture is the Holy of Holies. And so the pair of incense altars found in the Holy of Holies of Tel Arad temple were found to have had residues of frankincense and cannabis. So these things were dug up decades ago and have been sitting in the Jerusalem Museum, in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem for all these years. And people have noticed that there was still a residue of organic material on the incense altars. And so finally, only in the 2000s, this work is from like 2020 or 2022. It's really recent science. They scraped up the residue and did the sequencing on it, and they came up with one of them, it's frankincense, the other one it's cannabis. Man, they were burning hash on the altar. And the two standing, this is one of the sites where they found all the inscriptions to Yahweh and his Asherah. And those two standing stones, one is a Yahweh standing stone, and the other one is an Asherah standing stone. And the tall one with the tall altar is for Yahweh, and the shorter standing stone, shorter altar, are for Asherah. And that's the stuff that got buried and gotten rid of. All right, there's another slide about that. We can talk about it some more. So keep the next slide. All right, so this is a reference from Isaiah of a live call from the altar. It's not one of the Cana references, but it's a reference where we think that they are, doing drugs, basically burning hash in the temple. So this is from the prophet Isaiah. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, "Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven." So this is one of the ones where frankincense, myrrh, and cannabis were routinely blended to make intoxicating incense. And the whole thing about your sin and iniquity is verbiage that is used repeatedly in these same references. This is one Chris likes to talk about. He's very big on like these references where they're like actually burning hash. And then there's Isaiah, there's one with Isaiah, another one with Ezekiel, where they have these really like psychedelic, phantasmagoric visions of like God and like the flaming altars and all this stuff. Like those are like, we think they're totally drug experiences. Like, and that this is one of them. Anyway, yeah, go to the next slide. This was Chris's slide. He has more to say about that one. This is the one I like. God appears in a pillar of smoke. So when I was talking about Moses being Rasta, every time in the first, from Moses all the way through the first temple, when God appears, it's always in a pillar of smoke. So Yahweh said to Moses, "I'm going to come to you in a dense cloud, so the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you." That's Exodus 19:9. And then in First Kings, this is, and then every time there must be a dozen references of Yahweh coming to Moses in a cloud of smoke. But then it continues all the way through the first temple. So this is later on, Book of Kings. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of Yahweh, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of Yahweh filled his temple. That's 1 Kings 8:10 and 11. This pillar of smoke motif does not come back in the second temple. It's just long been noted. People have always noted this. The pillar of smoke is only in the first temple, never in the second temple. The pillar of smoke, my friend, is marijuana. They don't like marijuana at a certain point. They get rid of it. You know who does like marijuana? The mother goddess loves marijuana. Because it's not a drug, it's a fiber, and they do all the weaving. So it's all the drugs and the weaving and the sex, because it's an aphrodisiac. It all goes together. So when they get rid of Asherah, they throw the cannabis out with it.
Man, hey, listen. I gotta send you this discussion. Me and my brother Captain K, who's a captain at the ISUPK. He and I had on cannabis versus marijuana versus alcohol, and because alcohol is permitted and marijuana isn't, and I'm just listening to this and I'm like, so at one point that wasn't the case, but then somewhere along the line it changed. But
well, I mean, it never went away in Hinduism. It never went away in India. So the other parts of the world where there's an unbroken chain of cannabis being used in sacred terms. It's certain religions don't like it. The question is why? Why don't they like it? What is it about the Abrahamic faith that they don't like marijuana? The Jews and Christians and the Muslims have a very mixed feeling about it, depending on who you ask. But they don't really. The conservative Muslims don't like it either, even though the Arab culture likes it. The conservative Islam does not. Well, what are these? These are all the monotheistic faiths with no divine mother. That's what these religions have in common. There's no divine mother. But the religions that have the divine mother, they've all got cannabis. In fact, that was sort of one of my theses is that the goddess is strongest where cannabis grows thickest. And so you go places in the world and in history where cannabis is thriving, and you'll find lots of mother goddess talk and lots of mother goddess stuff going on, including modern day hippies. Anyway, next slide. So the Yahweh alone Reformation. This is perfect. So obviously we go from paganism to monotheism, and we live in a world where, in the West, in the Abrahamic faith, where it's just Yahweh alone, only one God. So that was a transition. That was a reformation that happened in the first temple and then completes during the Babylonian exile. But basically they were polytheistic the entire first temple, and they're having an argument about it. So the Yahweh alone Reformation. The reforms of the kings Hezekiah and Josiah in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE were aimed at shutting down the popular religion of the mother goddess Asherah, Astarte, the queen of heaven, and Anat, the terrifying goddess of destruction. There's 3 goddesses. And the Canaanite Israelite polytheistic pantheon. So the Israelites are Canaanites, and they have the same pantheon of gods as the rest of the Canaanites. El was the heavenly father, the creator of the universe. Baal, the god of storms and rain, was the king of the gods and one of El's sons. He's like Zeus. Baal is like Zeus. He's the Canaanite Zeus. And Yahweh was originally just another pagan god, but he rose up, defeated Baal, and then was ultimately merged with El to become the monotheistic God of the Bible. But in the beginning, when we first meet Yahweh, he's just another god in a pagan pantheon. And the God of the Bible, I think that's what we talked about last time. The God of the Bible is really 2 separate gods that get syncretized together, El and Yahweh, which is why we have 2 names for God in the Bible, God and the Lord, because these were originally 2 separate gods whose stories get stitched together to become one ultimate God. And they weren't alone in doing this. Serapis for the Hellenistic Greeks, after they took over Egypt, after Alexander the Great, and they start merging the Greek and Egyptian pantheons, they created Serapis, who is the merge of Zeus and Osiris. Right. But he's really like all the gods. He's like the all-father that has all the high gods all rolled into one. And his spouse is Isis. And Isis was the all-mother. And she gets syncretized with all the goddesses. And she is the all-mother during the late Roman era. And so Isis and Serapis and that mystery religion was the biggest rivalry to Christianity. That was the most popular religion in the Roman Empire, the biggest rival to Christianity, and the last of the pagan traditions to hold on as Christianity took over. The very last pagan temples to get shut down were temples to Isis.
So this presentation really does intersect with your book and your other work.
Yeah, this is how I got started. This is how I got started. I was looking into the cannabis stuff, and I stumbled into the Asherah stuff. And then I was so flabbergasted by the Asherah stuff that I realized it took me a while, but I finally figured out that was a much bigger and more important story. Okay. And so if you read my book, it's like it started out as the history of cannabis, and it turned into a history of the goddess. And then for the most of the time, I was writing a book called Cannabis and the Goddess, and it was only right at the very end when I just made a history of the goddess and made cannabis sort of a minor part of it. But it started out as cannabis in the Bible. And then I realized that cannabis is really just a character in the story of the mother goddess and the goddesses. But cannabis never went away and the goddess never went away, and they're all still around. Anyway, let's hit the next slide. All right, so the goddess traditions, here we are. They were rooted in prehistoric tribal matriarchies and focused on the cycle of life, death, and regeneration. These traditions celebrated women's sexuality as a source of life and featured alcohol, psychoactive plant drugs, music, dance, feasts, and great celebrations of life. Um, these goddess traditions continued in Greece and Rome in the Eleusinian Mysteries, the Dionysus Bacchus cults, the Magna Mater and Cybele cults, Isis Mysteries, and many others. Transgender priests were a common feature of these goddess traditions. They are known as the Kadesh, the temple sodomites in the Bible, and were chased away in the reforms. The Kadesha, the temple translated as temple prostitutes, were the priestesses. So the Kadesh and the Kadesha, we could do a whole topic on those. But yeah, transgender folks were always the Galli priests of Cybele in Rome, and the Megabyzi priests, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. There's a whole heap of them. In the Bible, they're called the Kadesh, and it means the holy ones. And the priestesses are the Kadesha. And they're the ones, again, they get thrown out. They're the priestesses of the mother goddess, and they're the ones who do all the weaving and midwifery and all this stuff. And so the cannabis is part of their traditions. And when they get thrown out, the cannabis gets thrown out with them. Because really, it's this divorce of the mother and the father that is the most important final step in the manufacturing of monotheism and creating monotheism as a theology. And it's the part that has been missing in Western culture ever since, that we don't have a clear sense of the Divine Mother, which has been humanity's most popular religion for most of our history. Like 50,000 years of mother goddess traditions and like 2,000 years of father alone. Like, we need to bring the mother back to go with the father. And because to me, like, that makes sense. Like, I understand the atheism, the criticisms of Christianity, but it never translated to me to becoming an atheist. I get it that like there's something wrong with Christian theology that doesn't work for me and doesn't work for a lot of folks, but it doesn't translate to atheism for me, which I think is actually worse. Once I started learning about the mother and the Divine Mother, and that this is actually a real tradition with real wisdom and really something to learn, then it really helped me make sense of the father, because like they fit together like yin yang and they don't contradict. And the Hindus have very sophisticated teachings about the mother. Native Americans do. So I learned from other contemporary cultures about how to make it all fit together. And it really helped me make sense of the father. Because one thing with the mother and the father, the way they fit together and why they don't contradict, is because the father is immaterial. Like, you can't touch the Holy Father, right? The Heavenly Father. Everyone agrees. One thing, whether you believe in God or not, we all agree you can't touch him, see him, taste him, smell him. You can't put your fingers on him. But the mother is the material world. Magna Mater, material, matter. That's where we get the name matter. She is the material. She is the living web of biological life. She is the physical flesh from which our flesh is born and that our flesh returns to. You can touch your mother. You can touch the Divine Mother. You can taste her. You can put your fingers in. You can dig your toes and walk around barefoot in the forest. And that is your living, breathing mother. And that's what indigenous people never lost sight of. And that's what all these old pagan cycle of life traditions are all rooted in. They're all rooted in life, death, and renewal, and the turning of the seasons, and celebrating these annual turning of the seasons. That's what the mother is all about. They call them fertility cults, but they're really life, death, and renewal religions. And it's a beautiful religion. There's nothing wrong with it.
Cycle, yeah.
I mean, I can see why it got corrupted. There's a lot of sex. I mean, they celebrate sexuality. And in the old matriarchal eras, when you counted bloodlines to the mother, then it didn't matter who women were having sex with. This is part of the argument and part of the Reformation and the transition. It's not just the Jews. It's the whole Near East is transitioning from tribal matriarchal family structures that had been the default of humanity. As we get into the Bronze Age, kingship is a new thing, is a new phenomenon. Kingship is only 5,000 years old, and patriarchy follows kingship. And it's only when kings start taking over in the Bronze Age with their weapons and their warfare and imposing themselves as a new ruling class on top of indigenous people that have been living there for like thousands of years just fine by themselves with no kings and no armies and no slavery. But at a certain point in history, the kings and armies and slavery come on the scene. And at a certain point, like either join up or get wiped out.
Right.
And so social structures shift from a default of matriarchy to a default of patriarchy. But in that matriarchal era, women had free sex lives. Indigenous people, the women have free sex lives because you're not tracking paternity. It's when you control for paternity, then you got to control women's sex lives because you don't know who the baby daddy is. Indigenous people track their families through the mothers. If you track your families through the mother's line, the father is anonymous. You don't know who the seed donor is. And so that's why you have all these sex traditions where the women can have all these ribald sex lives because they're not controlling for paternity. But once you start shifting to controlling for paternity, everything gets a lot more controversial and difficult. And then ultimately,
women have to be virgins.
women got to be virgins. And then ultimately the sex traditions go away. And the public sex, because but they lasted for a long time. And but this is totally what they're fighting about in the Old Testament. When the Old Testament prophets are like railing on these Canaanite women for their sex lives and their adultery and their promiscuity and all this stuff. As a kid, I was like, really? Like, what the heck is going on? Like, it just doesn't make sense, like it's the entire society. Like, but then once I put two together that they're really just indigenous people with like the same kind of indigenous sex lives that missionaries were talking about in the 1600s, where the missionaries were completely scandalized by the sex lives of Native Americans and South Pacific Islanders and stuff. They weren't really doing anything that outrageous, but so
exactly.
If you're controlling for paternity, it all seems utterly outrageous. If you're not controlling for paternity, then the father's not concerned who his daughter spends the night with some traveler, and that's, I think, at heart of this temple prostitution and this transition from something that goes sacred to women to being taken away from women. I genuinely believe that in the beginning, all the temple prostitution was women's business. They kept the money. They kept it all. They're in charge of the whole business. They're not being pimped out by men. They're not sex slaves in the beginning. It switches over time. The men take over time, and it gets all degraded eventually. But the original roots of the stuff, I think, was 100% women's business and 100% women keeping the money, taking it back. Because like part of these matriarchal traditions is that when you get married, the man would go live with the woman's family and not the other way around. And the women owned the property and all the inheritances flow through the women. And you see this in the older Bronze Age traditions, and then you see it switching. And you see this is one of the things that they're arguing about is like family structures. And it's particularly in the second millennium BC, in the Bronze Age, this is a competition. They're trying to convince women to like come live in these fathers' families. The Book of Ruth is all about, and the story of Judah and Tamar, where like she goes and lives with her husband's family. When her husband dies, she's stuck without a kid, and so her position is insecure in the family. But if it had been the other way around, that if the husband got to live with her family and she had never left home and her husband dies, well, who cares? She's just fine. And then when you have an unhappy marriage, they kick the man out and the girl stays. She never left home. She's still there with her mother and her sisters and her aunties, and they keep the babies. And they don't just tend the hearth and home, they own the hearth and home. And this is what tribal matriarchies were all about. This is why you see people like Deborah in the older parts of the Bible where the women have a speaking voice because they were matriarchs. Abraham and Sarah. Sarah's a matriarch. She's naming the children. She's the one kicking out, what's her name? The Hagar, the slave girl.
Right.
Because Abraham and Sarah is actually a matriarchal family, and so is Jacob and Rachel and Leah. And we can have a whole thing about the matriarchal stuff. But that's part of the theme of my book is this transition from matriarchy to patriarchy, and that and you can see it over like a 2,500 year period in the mythologies that the goddesses lose status alongside the women losing status. And the older stories is when women held higher status and the goddesses were more powerful. And you see them fighting about it. And you see ultimately the goddesses getting struck down, part as hand in hand of women losing their status in society. And which is why I think it's so interesting to bring this stuff back up, because partly it was a technology shift at that time. There was the shift into the Bronze Age was a huge shift. And then the shift into the Iron Age is another huge shift. And then we lived in the Iron Age for basically 3,000 years. And now we're going into the Space Age. And we don't live in the Iron Age anymore. And that's why all of our old Iron Age religions are all failing. because all the religions we have today are all from the Iron Age, and they're all breaking down now in the face of living in the space age.
And would you say that if we still were in the mother goddess mode, it would be harder to steer us away from our spiritual practices?
I think that I think this is a great opportunity to reinvigorate the conversation about our spiritual practices, to introduce some new concepts and some old concepts, and to reframe the conversation, especially for people like myself and maybe you, and I think a lot of Black folks like this, that are not content with Christianity that we were raised with, and that are leaving the church, but they're not becoming the folks that are spiritual but not religious. And so maybe I shouldn't plump the Black community in this. Still, I'm only speaking for myself. The folks that are spiritual but not religious, who've left Christianity, but are still feeling that there's something there. They're not ready to become atheists. I think reintroducing these old ideas, especially for people that are experimenting with psychedelics, because psychedelics are a big part of this. And it's a great way to just reframe the conversation. And I'm doing this other one about the resurrection, that I tie the resurrection of Jesus back to all this stuff. And again, it becomes a way to just change up the conversation and actually tap into some really genuine wisdom. I really approach this stuff as an environmentalist, and that's how I kind of got into all this Gaia. You know, I'm one of those crazy environmentalists, green wackos with Mother Goddess Gaia stuff. But I actually believe that all this circularity and ties back to my feelings about a circular economy and how we need to reintegrate industrial civilization back into the biosphere, or else we're all going to get wiped out by a very angry Kali who's ready to get rid of us. Until we start, when we put ecology, we need to recognize the importance of ecology, of Mother Earth and Mother Nature as at a moral and spiritual level. And when we do that, I think we can actually have a civilization that works with nature, but we don't have those ethical values today. Those ethical values are rooted in religion, and the religions we have are all divorced from nature. And the Enlightenment thinking is even worse. They're even worse for nature. So none of our current religions are good for nature, and the scientists are even worse. So I'm hopeful that maybe by reinvigorating this conversation about what were really incredibly popular religions for a very long time, and there's nothing ugly about them. Ugly elements, sure, but there's nothing wrong with the cycle of life traditions of the Divine Mother. These are beautiful traditions.
Let me bring up a question from my brother Rocky. Can you see the screen?
Yeah. All right. Why did that transition happen? What was the reason for the ontological change? Well, I think that it takes place over a long period of time. And basically, I think that with the introduction of the Bronze Age, the introduction of kingship, which is what brings us kings, armies, slavery, and sort of class-based society. On one hand, I think it's simply men taking power and asserting themselves over women, and it's just a raw pursuit of power. Then I think you get into something else. There's a Bronze Age collapse around the year 1200, and then for about 300 years, from 1200 BC to 900 BC, is a total Dark Ages and a total civilizational meltdown. And that's the period of the Exodus, the period of the Trojan War. That's the period when King David and King Solomon are around. So this is an illiterate time period, and it's a very chaotic time period. When we come out of it, we come into the Iron Age in the first millennium BC, and that's when we get all of classical antiquity. That's when we get the Greeks and the Hebrews and the Old Testament. That is when the women just seem to completely lose all their power. Whatever vestiges of authority women still had in the Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age, they seem to lose it all in the Iron Age. Because by the time you get into after 900 BC, 800, going forward, in all the cultures around the Near East, it seems bad for women everywhere. The Syrians, the Persians, the Greeks, they all seem to treat the women pretty lousy. So, I don't have a grand thesis for why it happened per se, except that we can identify it on the historical timeline, and we can identify some of the factors involved. But I think it's big and complicated, but clearly it's it's men taking power and asserting themselves over women. And there's certainly a raw power aspect of it. And controlling for paternity. The Greeks were very proud of imposing their form of marriage, which is the same form of marriage we have now, where one man, one woman, where the woman is monogamous and the man is not, or not expected to be. Like that kind of patriarchal marriage was something that the Greeks, it's not to say people didn't have marriages before, they obviously did have had marriages forever, but that kind of like that marriage with that particularly power dynamic that's defined by Zeus and Hera, where Zeus can run around and chase, every woman he wants, and then Hera's response to his infidelities is simply to run down the women and not punish Zeus at all. Like
and their
that kind
children.
of, and punish the children too, which is the dynamic we see all the way into history, right in through the marriage of Bill and Hillary Clinton, right in the modern day, where Bill Clinton is the powerful Zeus character running around getting all the tail he can get. And Hillary, every time she gets embarrassed publicly, she runs down the women. She never runs down Bill. She runs down the women, Jennifer Flowers and the rest of them, Monica Lewinsky and all of those. So anyway, that dynamic.
That's crazy.
Isn't that crazy, right? Like the combination, that comparison of Bill and Hillary Clinton to Zeus and Hera. I wish I had mentioned that. I did not. It was pointed out to me. It's brilliant, though. It is, in fact, precisely accurate. And it kind of defines Western culture from the time of the Greeks until today, until Me Too. And really, it's this transformation, again, into the space age, the digital age, where women are getting power back. Me Too was a women's digital mob where they took out a bunch of powerful men using a new set of tools that were never available before to burn out a bunch of powerful men who'd been exploiting women. Now, at a certain point, it goes too far and they start taking out innocent men, but like they took out, the times are changing, folks. Like men aren't getting away with the same kind of behavior our dads did, and then my father certainly did.
Look,
I don't know what your dad was like, but
I tell my father all the time, hey man, you are lucky not to have been born in this day and age.
I know. Oh my God, my father would have been tarred and feathered, man. No, my dad was out of the old Mad Men, John F. Kennedy era. James Bond is the role model for how to be a man. Like that was. And that just does not fly anymore. And that is a function of technology and digitalization and all this stuff. And anyway, let's go to the next slide.
Shout out to my favorites, my fellow St. Louis and John Hamm, who played one of the greatest TV characters of all time, Dom Draper.
All right. So
when you said Mad Men, I couldn't help but think about that.
So King Hezekiah's reforms. So now we're talking about these reforms. These are actual historical things. So the Book of Kings, I believe it actually has a ton of good. I do. I worked in the weed business, and I wrote this book on the beach of Humboldt County, California. And if you know the that's where I wrote the first draft of this. So King Hezekiah's reforms. These are actual historical events. The Book of Kings has got a ton of real history. Anyone who wants to say otherwise does not clearly study the archaeology. So King Hezekiah's reforms. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called the Nehushtan. That is 2 Kings 18:4. King Hezekiah was king of Judah from 715 to 686 BCE. These reforms were early in his reign, and he is a historical figure thoroughly attested by archaeologists. There's no question that he's a real person, or that these reforms, generally speaking, really did happen. Now, back to Moses, the bronze snake Moses made. This is another one of the things about Moses that has shifted over time. Moses, the snake was great for Moses. He had a snake staff, and he makes the bronze snake. There's all the stuff with the snake. But then later on in the Garden of Eden, the snake is bad. Well, the snake is, again, part of the goddess traditions and is wrapped up in these life-death renewal traditions. Snakes were very, very important to goddesses. You see tons of it. The snakes turning up the tree of life, that's all Mother Goddess tradition stuff. All right, next slide. All right, this is those, back to Tel Arad again. These twin standing stones, as I was explaining this before, were for Yahweh and his Asherah. They stood in the Holy of Holies. They were carefully laid down and buried by hand. So The picture we showed before was the one in the Jerusalem Museum. It did not have the standing stone on the right. These pictures here are from the actual archaeological site. So on the picture on the left is how the archaeologists dug it out. So the incense altars were all carefully laid down, not smashed, laid on their sides, and then buried with dirt. It's all been cleaned out by now. And then on the picture on the right is where they've been reconstructed. So the twin standing stones, this is one of the key evidences of Yahweh and his Asherah and of the pagan worship during the first temple period, that Yahweh was just another god in the pantheon, a high god in the pantheon, competing with Baal to be king of the gods, but nonetheless a god in the pantheon. And it's a totally polytheistic context. The entire first temple was pagan, my friends. Whole first temple was pagan. They don't even have a concept of monotheism. They're working their way towards it. They might actually, I take that last line back. They might have a concept of monotheism, but it's not the priests might have that concept, I should say, the philosophers, but not the general public. For the general public, the general culture of Israel in the first temple, 100% polytheistic. All right, next slide. I want to make sure we get through them all. King Josiah, he was the second big reformer. He comes a century later. He did it. These reforms, by the way, were totally unpopular. Both kings, when they were dead, the pagans come right back. They put the Asherah poles. Asherah is the mother goddess, and she's worshipped with a totem pole. So the Asherah poles, they cut them down. As soon as these kings are dead, both Hezekiah and Josiah, the pagans come right back and restore all the paganism. These reforms were not popular, and they did not stick. Anyway, King Josiah, back to the Book of Kings, 2 Kings. He did away with idolatrous priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places, burning incense of the towns of Judah and of those around Jerusalem. Those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, and to the constellations and all the starry hosts. They're just describing the pagan pantheon of the stars and planets. Venus being Astarte being Venus and all that. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of Yahweh to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. So King Josiah ruled Judah from 640 to 609 BCE, and these reforms were around 630 BCE. We could do a whole long thing about this, but let's hit the next slide. But yeah, he's a real person, not as thoroughly tested as King Hezekiah, but Josiah is presumably real too. All right, more of his reforms. He tore down the quarters of the male Kadesh. I was describing them before. The holy ones, the temple sodomites that were in the temple of Yahweh. The quarters where the women did weaving for Asherah. Weaving is women's business. And cannabis is a fiber and a drug. It's a very important fiber because it's a strong fiber. Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. Even the altar at Bethel, even that altar in high place, he demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder and burned the Asherah pole also. So anyway, pagan reforms. Let's hit the next slide. I want to. All right. So yeah. All right. This is the last of the 5 references to cannabis. This is Prophet Jeremiah. He's late. He's around during Josiah, and he witnesses the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's part of one of the exiles. He doesn't go to Babylon, but he gets exiled to Egypt. What do I care about frankincense from Sheba or cannabis from a distant land? Your burnt offerings are not acceptable. Your sacrifices do not please me. This is where Yahweh is really pissed off, because this is right when the Babylonians are about to sack Jerusalem completely. So Jeremiah was a leading prophet of Yahweh during Josiah's reign, who witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem and went to exile in Egypt. Yeah, that's what I just said. So yeah, this is when this is actually the one I was mentioning where Chris Bennett argues that this is when they're rejecting cannabis. Perhaps at any rate, they're definitely talking about it as a burnt offering. Next slide. All right, so the women defend the Queen of Heaven. This is important. Back to the goddesses. This is, again, Prophet Jeremiah. This is chapter 44. This is after the destruction of Jerusalem, and they've been sent into exile. And Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, is being harshly critical of all the women and all the people for all their idolatrous pagan behavior. But check out what the women say in response. So the Queen of Heaven, let me mention this first. Astarte, there's 3 goddesses that are in the Old Testament: Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. The goddess comes in this triple goddess form. So that was the Israelite triple goddess. So, but Anat never gets mentioned. So the only two that get mentioned are Asherah and Astarte. Astarte is like Aphrodite. She's the goddess of love and war. She's like Ishtar of Babylon. She is the maiden and the mother of maiden in death, and she's really the most popular one. She's the one that King Solomon was worshiping, and she's part of this tradition that's long acknowledged by scholars that goes from Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, Urania, and then Venus for the Roman Venus. It's all the same goddess. They're all associated with the planet Venus, and it's like a 3,000-year long tradition, if not more. So anyway, this is the women. This is the women shouting back at Jeremiah. We will not listen to the message you have spoken to us in the name of Yahweh. We will certainly do everything we said we would. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven, and we will pour out drink offerings to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials did in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. At that time, we had plenty of food, and we were well off and suffered no harm. But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have had nothing and have been perishing by sword and famine. And wow. Yeah, and so it goes on. The passage goes on, and they go back and forth. And Jeremiah ultimately says, "Fine, do what you will," and he leaves and stomps off. And the women never, they maintain their worship of the Queen of Heaven.
So they say, in other words, look, we was eating good under the mother.
Exactly. That's exactly what they're saying.
But Pops ain't really, kicking in. That's crazy.
Considering that Josiah, he goes and gets killed. Like, after all of his reforms, he goes out and fights the Egyptians and gets killed on the field of battle in a fight that he never even should have taken up in the first place. So anyway, next slide.
Them damn Egyptians.
All right, so now we're into the Garden of Eden. So now I mentioned the 5 verses. Now this is my theological argument. I argue that in the Garden of Eden, that cannabis, well, Chris and I, we've all been arguing for a while now that Eve represents Asherah and that Eve represents these goddess traditions being thrown out. I'm going to go farther than that and say that the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the forbidden fruit, is specifically cannabis, and that they are specifically condemning it as part and parcel of. Right, so I'm going to read the verses here.
That's deep. That's deep. Go ahead.
All right. And so these are this is quotes from Genesis. And Yahweh God commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die." "You will certainly not die," the serpent said to the woman, "for God knows that you will eat, that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." All right, next slide. I trust the audience is familiar with the Garden of Eden story. We don't need to do a whole lot of background on this. So the Garden of Eden story was, I call it the divorce of the sacred marriage. The Garden of Eden story was likely written during the reforms of Kings Hezekiah and Josiah, sometime during that period, when the Yahwists were working hard to shut down the popular goddess traditions. Like Hesiod's Pandora, so that's Greek mythology about Pandora, which is totally contemporary, same time period. The first woman, Eve, was cast as a source of all men's troubles, and that she must be restrained. The great goddess traditions were matriarchal women's religions, and the patriarchal Yahweh shut them down so the Heavenly Father could rule alone with no wife or competing authority. All right, go on to the next slide. We'll get into the verses. Eve is Asherah. So Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all living. As I was explaining, the Garden of Eden story is a condemnation of the traditional goddess religion of Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. All right, next slide. The serpent. Serpents and sacred plants were important in goddess traditions, and their symbolism is widespread. The tree of life is often associated with both goddesses and serpents. The Yahwists turned the serpent from a symbol of mystical power and wisdom into a symbol of deceit. Now, this picture on the right is very important. This is the Egyptian version of Asherah, where they also use the name Kadesh. They called her the Holy One. And she's explicitly syncretized with this from the second millennium, like 1400 BC, pre-Exodus, when Egypt still ruled Canaan, and so all the Egyptian and Canaanite gods were heavily syncretized. So this is this goddess. This is Ashura with the name Kadesh, and you can see all the symbols. So she's naked. On her hair, she's got the goddess symbols of Isis and Hathor, the bull horns and the Hathor of hair. Hathor is there's two mother goddesses in Egypt, Isis and Hathor. And Hathor was known for her beauty, and her hair was this sign of her like legendary beauty. So when she's got Hathor's hair, it's that she's very beautiful. And so she's standing on a lion, which is a symbol of the goddesses. In her left hand is a serpent, and in her right hand is sacred plants. I believe it's a lily. And now to our right, there's a trinity of gods here. So we're to our right, on our right hand, is the Egyptian god Min, who's, you might tell, he's a fertility god because he's got some appendages going on there. So you might notice he is a very old fertility god for the Egyptians. But on our left hand is a Canaanite god. That god is named Reshpesh, and he's like a death god. He's kind of like Apollo, and he shoots arrows, except they're arrows of like disease, and like you don't want to be. You pray to Reshpesh that his arrows hit the next guy and not you. And so he's like a death god. So this is another trinity, another life-death renewal trinity that has Asherah, or Kadesh in this case, the Holy One, at the center of it. And this is Egyptian Canaanite religion pre-Exodus. This is the stuff that the Yahwists are reforming against. This is the stuff they hate. But you see the serpent, you see the sacred plants, the lions, the sex, the drugs, all of it. Yeah, this is my favorite picture of Asherah. All right, so next slide. So this is back to the weaving. So weaving hemp fibers. Asherah was a goddess of weaving, and weaving was women's business. Cannabis hemp was a primary fiber for ropes and linens and was highly valued in industry and ritual throughout the ancient world. Hemp clothes were commonly worn in funeral rituals in Judaism and across the world, from Europe to China. There is a ton to be said about the ritual use of hemp, especially in China. But it has been used it is a they call it in some traditions they call it the Alpha and the Omega, because it is the fiber that wraps the newborn in the corpse. Midwives would use it as a sacred fiber to wrap a newborn baby, but then you would also be buried in hemp fibers when you're dead. And it was this ritualistic fiber. And in Confucian China, because hemp is all over China, it's very much a hemp culture, hemp fiber culture. There's very elaborate rituals spelled out in Confucian texts about wearing hemp fibers during funeral rituals, because it's like sackcloth. It's like not the nice clothes. These are your rough. When they talk about wearing sackcloth for mourning and wearing like literally like a bag, that would be hemp, my friend, because hemp is a rough fiber. It's a strong fiber. They use it for ropes and shipbuilding, but you also use it for sackcloth and for rough work. Linen from the flax plant is used for fine fibers. And then also you get fine fibers off of a hemp plant that can be blended with linen, but all the rough fibers are always hemp. And so when they talk about mourning rituals and wearing hemp or wearing sackcloth, wearing hemp, there's just a lot to be said about it. And it goes back with, again, back to the women and the weaving. So part of the argument that hemp was deeply sacred. Next slide, I think, is we got a couple more slides here. All right. So what is the tree of knowledge? All right, here we go. Genesis 3, 6, and 7. When the woman saw the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. This is the verses that explicitly describe the tree of knowledge and the Garden of Eden. Genesis 3, 6, and 7. All right, go to the next slide. I'm going to make the case that this is an explicit description of cannabis. All right. The fruit of the tree was good for food. Check. Cannabis seeds are among the most nutritious seeds found anywhere in nature, valued by humans, animals, and birds. You can buy hemp seed food products in the health food store today. The woman saw the plant was pleasing to the eye. Check. Cannabis is widely regarded as a beautiful, attractive plant, especially if you're a pothead. The plant is desirable for gaining wisdom. Cannabis has long been used in religion and ritual, valued for its capacity to promote shamanistic insight and meditative reflection. Adam and Eve ate the fruit and their eyes were opened. They realized they were naked. They ate the cannabis, got high, and had ideas. This is a classic entheogenic experience. Finally, they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. They used the hemp fibers to sew the clothes. They didn't sew anything without some fibers to be sewing with. So all of it, every single line from Genesis 3, 6, and 7 can be attributed to be cannabis, much more than an apple or anything else. They didn't have apples back then anyway. All right, so next slide. I think we must be almost to the end. All right, cannabis midwifery. To the woman, he said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. This comes after they've eaten it. They've been discovered by God, and now they're getting punished. So the woman, he says, I'll make your pains in childbearing very severe. Well, just as it turns out, those Kadesha priestesses I was mentioning, you know what they're known for? One of the most things they're most famous for in the ancient world? Being midwives. They mix up mystery potions and were midwives. And one of the things that goddesses and midwives would be celebrated for was a painless childbirth. Well, you know what's good for that? There's many medicines, of course. They would be mixing up all sorts of medicines, but cannabis happens to be particularly good for it. It's documented in extremely ancient Egyptian medical texts and Israelite archaeology as being used for midwifery. We have all sorts of evidence for it. And as I was saying, the Kadesha priestesses were famed for midwifery skills, potion making, and weaving. The Yahwists are putting them out of business. In the book of Deuteronomy, in the laws of Deuteronomy, it says, your daughter will not be a Kadesha. Your daughter will not be a Kadesha. They are putting this entire class of priestesses and their traditions out of business. And one of those things was the midwifery. We've been hostile to midwives right up into the modern day. Because it's one thing that gives women power over life and death. It's the kind of thing that scares men and scares people. All right, next slide. There's only a couple left. All right. No, this is the last one. Yeah, last slide. The Queen of Heaven overthrown. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. Genesis 3:16. This is where Eve is instructed that she will be monogamous to Adam. Adam gets no such instructions in return, but she is instructed that she will be submissive and monogamous to Adam. Keep in mind, there's a tradition of Lilith that Adam had a previous wife who was not submissive, not sexually submissive. She wanted to have sex on top. So they get rid of Lilith, bring in a nice submissive patriarchal wife, get rid of that old matriarchal wife who didn't listen to Adam's authority, and bring in a new wife who is going to listen to Adam's authority. The Greeks and the Hebrews are both doing this. They're both introducing this form of marriage where women are utterly subordinate and have had all of their independence, power, and authority, wealth taken away, and they're sent to the back to shut up and do the weaving. And so the Greeks and Hebrews both do it at the same time. Both mythologies are celebrating it, and they're totally contemporary with one another. And that's basically the argument I'll be making in my book. And the cannabis, this stuff is this will be one chapter in the book, basically. But yeah, that's my whole presentation.
Really, really interesting work. I mean,
and then there's more. So New Testament, I'm making the presentation that I'm going to be arguing swoon theory on. I'll be arguing Jesus' resurrection on Friday night, and then I'll do the presentation for you. I've been working on it. If you'd like,
absolutely.
I argue that swoon theory is the best explanation for the resurrection, and that just reading the Gospels, there's a very strong case to be made that Jesus was drugged, that his death was faked. It was all to the benefit of all because of the women. But the title of my argument is that the women were not just witnesses to the resurrection; they were completely responsible for it. That they drugged Jesus with the wine vinegar. They made him appear dead. They brought him down off the cross after just a couple short hours before he died, tended his wounds, laid him carefully to be undisturbed under heavy sedation to rest for 2 days, then carefully revived him. And that he was seen alive, but then died later on because he ascended to heaven after 40 days. So he didn't really survive for long, but he survived long enough to be seen alive after his very public execution. And that this is the best explanation that sticks to both science and to the Gospels, and that the drug that could actually do the job would be cannabis. That cannabis could actually, is medically speaking, could actually knock you out for 2 days, make you look like you're dead, and create all the symptoms like catalepsy, like the stiff limbs and everything. The cannabis is known and documented to have all of these effects, to have the Romeo and Juliet sort of a thing where you drink a mystery potion
Right.
and it makes you look like you're dead. That's the argument. I did not invent the argument, but that's what I'm presenting. And I think it's the best explanation for the resurrection. Way better than, the guy just died and they buried him anonymously. Like, I don't actually think
Man. Okay. Hey, listen, I know a lot of people gonna feel away about what he said, but this is his theory. So
anyway, I'll present that one to you too. That's a much shorter. I got that slide deck. I'm presenting it first on Friday night with a Christian apologist preacher.
Okay, yeah, I was just about to say he'll definitely be back to bring that information to us. So look,
that's gonna be a fun one.
Yeah, and you'll be debating on History Valley
on Jacob Berman's channel. Yeah, History Valley.
Okay, yeah. I'll definitely be tuning in. For those of you who joined us and those of you who catch the replay, go support our brother Ed Dodge in his debate over on Jacob Berman's channel, History Valley. Support him. He has been very gracious with me in coming on, and anytime I've requested it. At this time, the last time I talked to him about it, he was kind of busy, and this time he actually hit me up like, "Hey, I ain't got nothing going on. You ready to jump on?" So definitely appreciate you doing that. Appreciate your time. I don't know.
I don't know if you have any questions. I can rap about whatever you want, or we can. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm curious because I think I shared with you that for my mental health, I partake, and I went years without touching it because when I was young, when I was like 19, I was told, hey, you can't get a job if you're doing this. And me and my wife both sat and realized, even with me dealing with what I deal with regards to bipolar 2 disorder and how I would, go into these just severe mood swings, just hyper talkative, creativity on the highest level you could think of, super social, all of that, to I want to be alone in the dark, to I'm enraged and I'm ripping doors off hinges, screaming at everybody in sight, to I'm sad and I'm crying. That just, and
severe mood swings
went they say that these symptoms start to kind of kick in late teens, early 20s, and I was like 22, 23 when this began. But while I always had a temper as a kid, I started smoking weed probably about 13, and up until I was about 18, 19, when I started to have to get out into the real workforce and not like, Hardee's or McDonald's, I smoked. And so we realized that could have been happening already, but because I was partaking, I had sort of curtailed the early stages of it, because we could see certain look back in hindsight, of course, and see certain signs. But
so you're saying when you stopped smoking weed, your mood swings got worse?
Exactly. And we were wondering, like, we probably could have had this under a lot better control this whole time, but because it was so taboo, we stayed away from it. And then finally, she was just like, this not working. Because sometimes the stuff they give you, it just takes you completely out of yourself.
Yeah, geez.
And
I had a brother who's since passed, but he was epileptic and he liked smoking weed. And but we didn't really know, like, the evidence, like, wasn't really as clear, like, of weed and epilepsy, which is a damn shame because weed is
yeah,
great for epilepsy. And but he was always a little bit nervous about it, even though he liked it. So, he would only partake marginally, because he'd had to, like, quit drinking and everything, because, like, the
mhm,
epilepsy forced him to quit drinking, so he totally sobered up. So the weed, he was kind of California sober, smoke a little bit of weed here and there, but he was always a little bit nervous. He wasn't quite sure. We talked about it. We didn't know. Now we know so much more about, like, the cannabis medicine. It's amazing, and cannabis is a very complicated substance. It's unlike most of our, well, certainly all pharmaceuticals, but most of our conventional intoxicants are like one molecule. So, like, alcohol is just ethanol. It's the same ethanol molecule, one molecule, and has a very consistent effect on the human body, across all bodies, and it's consistent to all of us. And we, both personal experience and anecdotally, we know what those experiences are. Likewise, other drugs, very consistent: heroin, cocaine. They're usually one refined molecule, right? Um, Cannabis is not. Cannabis is this bouquet, this kaleidoscope of dozens of molecules that are not even static, that they're like changing form. Like THC has multiple forms, and there's all these dozens of cannabinoids, plus the terpenes and these other substances in there, and they're dynamic and they're like shifting form and they're interacting in a weird way. And then they are in turn interacting with multiple receptor sites, different types of receptor sites across your entire body. Like your endocannabinoid system, which has the receptor sites, was only recently discovered, and it's as complicated as your nervous system. And so there's like thousands and tens of thousands, or however many receptor sites in your body, the same way that opiates attach to endorphins. Like, endorphins are what your body makes, and they attach to a certain receptor site. And then opiates make a plant-based endorphin that attaches to the same receptor sites.
right.
The same thing with cannabis. You have a certain molecule inside of your own body. They call them endocannabinoids, the one that your body makes. And then the plant molecules are the same molecule and attach to the same receptor site. And so it speaks to some sort of coevolution between humans and these various plants,
That's
which is way
crazy.
above my pay grade. Like, I can't
Yeah,
even, but
exactly. Yeah, that's
deep,
crazy.
right? It's deep. And so cannabis historically always stymied the scientists. Like, at the time of prohibition 100 years ago in the 1930s, even though they'd been using cannabis and exploring it scientifically for a long time, they still had no idea how it worked. And they couldn't refine that. They didn't know what the exact chemicals were. And it's not water soluble, so you couldn't make an injectable out of it. And it's very difficult to, well, they didn't know what the chemicals were, so they couldn't test it. And they had, it's very difficult to, like, to dose, right? Like, especially when you make tinctures, you have no idea if this tincture is strong or weak or how much you should take. And so it was always very difficult for doctors to prescribe it because the quality of the drugs was always inconsistent. They had no way of testing for it to see if it was consistent. And then when you gave it to people, you had no idea how they were going to react to it. Some people loved it, some people hated it, some people didn't feel anything at all. Sometimes they take way too much and, like, check themselves in the hospital, could, like, have a psychic breakdown, but they never die. People have some very unpleasant experiences, but they never die. That's the Jesus thing, is that strong tinctures don't kill. They can knock you unconscious for 2 days, but they're not going to kill you. They can make you feel like you're going to have a total mental breakdown and you want to kill yourself, but it's not going to kill you like an opiate's going to kill you, right?
And that's what's so surprising to me about the stands that my brother Cap 10K and ISUPK takes. For them, if you smoke weed, you're a junkie. And I was like, wait, what? Because
that's just prohibition propaganda that's been heaped on us for so long that it's hard to separate that the stigma of marijuana is a drug and marijuana is drugs, as opposed to saying marijuana is a plant and opium is a manufactured synthetic drug product. Well, it's not synthetic, but a manufactured drug product, right? Now we have synthetics that are even worse. But yeah, I mean, that's just government propaganda. But one thing is worth pointing out is that drug prohibition does not start in the United States. It's not rooted in racism per se. the police has racism, so the law, the application was racist, but that's not the origins of it, because the United States was actually late to the game with drug prohibition. Drugs were outlawed internationally before the United States joined in. It was all mostly about opium prohibition, and then cannabis gets thrown in as a afterthought on international opium prohibition. And then conservative blacks and conservative Mexicans have hated marijuana every bit as much as conservative white folks do. So it's not like it's something that was forced by white people onto black folks. No, Mexicans, in fact, have hated marijuana way more than white folks ever did. And they outlawed marijuana. Mexican Catholics, I should say, not the Mexican indigenous people. Mexican Catholics, the Spanish Catholics, hated marijuana in the 1800s. They absolutely were terrified of it. And all of the sinister stories of marijuana causing murder and violence, that comes with the plant from Mexico over the border. It had already had a sinister reputation before it came to the United States. And then Mexico outlawed marijuana way before the United States did and insisted on the war on drugs. They were like, Mexico was a hardcore war on drugs all along. It's only like now in like the last 10, 20 years that Mexico is lightening up because of all the problems. But traditionally, conservative Mexican culture was hardcore drug prohibition. And you look at drug prohibition in Asia, where they're way harsher than anything in the West, where they were really, lock you up and throw away the key for a joint and stuff. Like it was never really that bad in the West. So as racist as the policing is, that's not the origins of drug prohibition, and it's just not the why we do it. Black people and Mexicans, they hated marijuana every bit as much as white folks did.
I had dropped the link, but nobody clicked, so I'm not gonna worry about it. So I got one last question. And where do you think, or where do you know, if you do know, the idea that marijuana was a gateway drug to some of these to me anyway, incomparable.
You want to know why it was? It was, they tried every other argument for marijuana. The prohibitionists did every bit of propaganda they could try. And the one that they finally stuck was the gateway drug. They tried, it'll turn you into a psycho murderer. That was what they were using. But they're like, after a while, we're like, no, we know that's not true. So then they said, in the 1940s, they're like, it's going to turn you into a pinko communist homosexual. And then after a while, they're like, it's not really going to turn you into a communist homosexual. But it's a gateway drug to heroin. That was the one that stuck. And it was just the one bit of rhetoric that they could get away with. It's totally not true. It's never been true. The only association cannabis and the hard drugs have is that they're all made illegal. And so by virtue of prohibition in the black market, you end up rubbing shoulders with those folks. But really, people who are satisfied with marijuana, they don't want hard drugs. And it's alcohol. It's always been alcohol that's the gateway drug for everything anyway. People have different drug appetites. So some people want the harder stuff and some people are satisfied with marijuana. And if anything, cannabis is the gateway out of the hard drugs. And it's the replacement. It's the way to step down from heavy, especially people that are on painkillers and get addicted to opiates because they have genuine like medical reasons to start up. And like the pain is a real thing. Mm-hmm. There are so many people that I've met in my life that have been able to break legitimate opiate addictions and transfer over to cannabis. In some cases, they're taking some outrageous quantities of cannabis, like thousands of milligrams of tinctures a day. Nonetheless, you can ramp up to that kind of thing. And if your body's tolerating it and you're happy with it, it'll be just fine. There's no toxicity to it at all. It's not going to ruin any of your why do you think they use racism? We live in a racist country. And so it was a very easy thing to demonize Mexicans because of marijuana, or to demonize black folks for marijuana. They demonized jazz music. Jazz music was wrapped up in all this too. In the 1930s and 40s, Harry Anslinger was the guy who started the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he was the guy who was most responsible for getting marijuana, for writing the laws against marijuana. And he was like this old school George Wallace type cracker, segregationist. He hated jazz music with a passion. And he hated all the jazz musicians of the 1930s. He hated Billie Holiday, hated Louis Armstrong, hated them all. And he was he would send out the undercover narcotics cops to harass and run down all the jazz musicians all over the country. And he had this dream of being this nationwide drug bust of all the, because marijuana was huge in the jazz scene in the prior to Prohibition, the 20s and 30s. They're singing about it, especially in the 1920s. There's so much, because that's the popular music of the 1920s was jazz, the dance music and everything. There's so much reefer. There's so many reefer songs in 1920s jazz music. It's crazy. In the 1920s and 30s until Prohibition is 1937. Right up until Prohibition, they were openly singing about it and openly smoking and openly doing it all. And so, but in that segregationist era, when you've got, literally Jim Crow, it's a very easy case to make. Like, get rid of these darkies. I don't mean to be rude, but like it's a very easy bit of rhetoric to slide into. But again, I want to remind you, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were not advocating people lighten up reefers. They were not. Your conservative black preachers were not advocating for marijuana. They were just as prohibitionist as the feds were. So it's important to point that out.
Just like today, like I Cap and Captain K and my brother the Slim Reaper, two guys that contribute to the channel, would likely not agree on much. One is a Calvinist and one is a Black Hebrew Israelite. I guarantee they would agree on marijuana not being good for anything.
Well, why? It's because they probably have old school patriarchal views, and like they're not, because cannabis leads to sex. Cannabis is very much an aphrodisiac, and that association with sex, drugs, and rock and roll is not new. It goes all the way back. So it's you'll always find cannabis with prostitution and associated with sexuality. Jazz music, when Louis Armstrong is basically the guy who invented jazz music for all intents and purposes, he invents it. He smoked marijuana every day of his life and was totally an open advocate for it. And he invented jazz music in the red light district in New Orleans. He grew up in New Orleans. He grew up in what was called, at the time, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Storyville. And it was the red light district in New Orleans at the turn of the century where they had all the, the brothels and stuff. And so jazz music was invented in these brothels by all these pot smoking musicians hanging out with the prostitutes, where they were away from the white folks. Like, these would be professional musicians playing for a white audience during the day, right? Playing whatever they're asked to play. But then at night, when it's just themselves and their friends and their own crowd, then they're getting high and they're riffing and they're inventing all this new music and having fun with it. It was invented in a brothel, literally invented in a brothel. And that association, sex and music, and then it continues into rock and roll. Rock and roll was a little bit boring until the Beatles started smoking weed. And then it got very interesting all of a sudden. And the same thing with hip hop. Hip hop is infused with marijuana. All three forms of American popular music that were exported out of America were absolutely 100% infused with marijuana and with sexuality. They're all these are not chaste musical forms.
So that kind of goes back to the goddess thing that you were talking about.
And it goes right back to the temples of Ishtar and Babylon and Astarte, that they're shutting down the nightclubs. They are literally shutting down the nightclubs.
That's crazy. I love it though. Like, you got me wanting to look more intently into this history of the goddess thing too, because what
I've been learning about recently, and I think your audience might really appreciate it, is how much Isis from Egypt, as we get into the late Roman era, was the most popular of all the goddesses. And one thing about goddesses, they all get syncretized together. The Hindus have it's called Shakti. It's the principle that all goddesses are Shakti. So all the goddesses can be readily, their names and stories can be readily fused with one another. And as they were going through this process formally, like in the Hellenistic era, and specifically in the city of Alexandria, is where they're doing all this stuff in the Greek and Roman world. And they're syncretizing all this goddess, Isis with Demeter, and Isis with Aphrodite, and Demeter, and all the and it sort of becomes like this Russian nesting dolls kind of thing. It's Isis that comes out on top as the grand matriarch of them all. The great goddess of them all ends up being Isis. And she is the mother of all the goddesses. And she is the one that has the most highly developed theology of the All Mother, and that where you can really combine them all into one really highly theological tradition that I think could really appeal to the modern world, because like, I don't see the modern woman wanting to go back to the harlot traditions of Ishtar, where it's like really gratuitously sexual and like gangbang sexual. Like that's not what today's women want. And I don't think they want the religion of Cybele, which was the old Magna Mater from Rome, which is like Neolithic and super bloody. And they're like sacrificing a bull on this grate above your head and pouring all the blood down on you. And the men are castrating themselves in this like, frenzied orgy. I don't think that's what the modern 21st century audience is looking for either. I'm pretty certain that's not going to be that cult is not going to have a big audience, right? A fringe audience, maybe, but not a mainstream.
Right. It's some people out there that's gonna mess with it, but yeah, it'll be fringe for sure.
But if you want a mainstream, highly refined, theological, respectable, philosophical tradition that can speak to a 21st century empowered woman and 21st century empowered men, frankly, who are not afraid of this stuff, I think ISIS, in late Roman era ISIS, is where to look. I think that's the connection to draw. And then that in turn draws you right back to the oldest traditions in Egypt and the most important traditions in Egypt. And the ones that were popular in the ancient world that got exported out of Egypt and still continued. Because ISIS was the most popular religion in all of Roman Empire. She was being worshipped in London. The city of Paris is named for her. We don't realize this. All across the Roman Empire, ISIS was very popular. It was an export religion. It was designed to be exported. It was so Isis and Serapis is the father. I was mentioning before. Serapis is the father. It's like all father and all mother, and they had gone through this elaborate theological exercise in the priests in Alexandria to link all these gods together, and so Isis and Serapis end up on top. And this was the great rivals to early Christianity. This is where they're having their heated disputes between pagan priests and St. Augustine, what have you. They'd be arguing about ISIS. It's ISIS they'd be arguing about. That was the one that had the highest philosophy and theology.
So she survived all the way up. She survived all the way up while existed while Christianity was still in this evolved.
The very last pagan temple to be shut down in Europe was an ISIS temple.
Wow.
Like in the 500s.
Wow. That's heavy. That's heavy.
But also likewise, ISIS has got our very oldest mythological literature, like the pyramid texts that describe the resurrection of Isis and Osiris, or Isis brings Osiris back. That's like our oldest written myth. So she's like the oldest and the latest, right? So it's like,
deep.
She's pretty cool, man.
Deep. That's deep. And I think people miss that when they right now you got all of this, you're Egyptologist, Egyptomaniac, this and you're this and that. And instead of just deal with that profound element that you just described, the oldest story, and then she lasts as a worshiped deity all the way to the 500. Like that's the heavy part. I could care less about all of the other rhetoric, but so yeah, I'm you gave me another nugget to kind of think about, but I definitely
I'll be digging into all this stuff. I'm writing this book this year, and so I'm working on these presentations, and I'll be digging into all this stuff. So I'll be happy to come back and
absolutely. Yeah, and I'll definitely be tuned in to the debate Friday. Remember, family, he is debating. Who's
Jonathan Sheffield is his name. He's a Christian apologist on Jacob Berman's channel.
Yeah, and so go over to History Valley with our guy Jacob and check out that debate. We'll be rooting for our guy Ed Dodge, and hopefully he'll take home the win. But sometimes these things are subjective, so we'll see. But I appreciate you coming on and providing.
I'm going to convince everybody of the truth of what exactly happened on the resurrection. We can bring the definitive answer.
You had a few. My brother, who's a urban apologist extraordinaire, he was in there going a little crazy. Like, so the women put the stone in front of the. He was getting where did that go?
I don't see the chats because I got it.
Yeah, he said shaking my head, so the women put the stone in front too.
They had help, they got conspirators. It was Joseph of Arimathea too, and Nicodemus, so they had help.
Exactly. So yeah, this. You know, I mean, I'm expecting that to be a lively conversation. So
Well, I've really been looking forward to this one because I've worked on the story for a little while, but I haven't created us like a presentation for it. So this will be a fun one.
okay, definitely. All right, we'll be checking it out. I appreciate you coming on.
All right.
All right, family.
All right. Peace and love to everybody. Thanks a lot for listening. I appreciate it.
All right, family. So, hey, listen, go over there, check him out on Jacob's channel this Friday. He's debating a really high level opponent, but I think our guy's gonna take it. So tune into that. Our brother, Classic Craig, Triple C, as I call him, will be back on Thursday. He has an interview with the one and only Isabio Robinson. Y'all come back for that. So we here. We trying to provide y'all with as much good stuff as we can. Also, real quick, Matt, let me put this this link in the chat. We got a new channel, Paradigm Shift TV 314 University. I want y'all to go subscribe to that channel, please. That's where I'll be having more conversations with individuals like yourself, authors, scholars of history, philosophy, things like that. And I'll be doing a lot of things exclusive over there. I'm trying to get people like Tovia Singer, Richard Carrier, even Bart Ehrman, if I could ever afford that price tag. But people like that, and like I said, people like yourself, I'll be going over there as well. So just trying to make a channel more akin to the myth visions of the world, where it's not as much engagement with the audience, but it'll be that content will be there for them to extract from, and it'll just be more of a straight-laced interview or a video lecture or a presentation, as opposed to engaging so much with the audience. But just something new. I'm trying.
Having to contribute some content to the university there.
I definitely appreciate it. So that's it, family. We are out. Go over and subscribe to that page. I'll be dropping the link more and more, getting some reminders. I'll also be promoting it over on Jacob's channel. So again, we will be black, and check out our brother on History Valley with Jacob Berman. Root for him in the debate. We'll see y'all next time. We out. That's peace.